I've got here an almost bone stock 65 reissue Fender Deluxe Reverb. I'll talk about why it's not stock later. And the owner brought it in for the regular reliability upgrades that I do. And because he said it sounded dark at low volumes. We'll get to that in a bit. But I thought this was also a good opportunity to talk about the Fender reissue series in general, because the issues that the Deluxe have are the same issues that plague the Twin, the Super, etc., the Princeton. They're all very similarly built. They all have the same kind of strengths and the same kinds of weaknesses. And I'm going to try to give an overview as we go. Fun little side note, I recorded about the first half of this video, and then on playback realized that my mic cable wasn't plugged all the way in, and all I had recorded for the voice was so I'm having to redub the beginning of this. It may sound a little bit weird as far as the timing. I'll try to offset that. From the front, it looks like a Deluxe Reverb. From the front, the Twin looks like a Twin. You know, they're really good looking amps. Let's see what's underneath the hood. From the rear, it's pretty much like the old ones, except there's a metal cage on later versions of the reissues, and that's to keep you from burning your fingers. Makes changing the tubes hard. I prefer to take it out for that reason, and you can just put new screws there, but you know, no big deal. The power cable in all the reissues except the Princeton is a hardwired cable, goes straight to the chassis, which you'd think is better than an IEC, except that cables take a lot of wear and tear. Over time, you know, someone will drop a cymbal on it, etc., etc. It will need to get replaced, at which point you have to pay a tech to change it out. The Princeton and other amps which have IEC connectors, you just get a new, $8 cable, plug it in, you're good to go. So, keep that in mind. I take the rear panel off and show you some other stuff. The fit and finish of the cabinet is really good. It's pine. It has same grade Deluxe it always has had. It's a really high quality cabinet, and the finish is usually great. You can see it's got those little rubber nipples protectors on the standby and power switch. I'm sure that's the same safety regulation source as the tube cage. Other than that, these later ones are pretty much fine. The earlier ones had a dummy ground polarity switch, like the old ones had. They were trying to be a reissue a little too seriously, and it was a $7 switch connected to nothing. The later reissues omitted that quite wisely, I think. Other differences are the reverb send and return jacks have moved to the bottom of the chassis, and instead of having separate RCA connections for the Footswitch, reverb, and tremolo, there's just a stereo TRS switch, which is better. Now here, I'm pointing out that this particular amp has 6 L6s as opposed to the more correct 6 V6s. We'll get to that later. So the Footswitch in the reissues is actually a much higher quality overall than the Footswitch in the originals, because it has a single real plug TRS tip ring sleeve, and that's a lot sturdier than the old design, which I'll show you next. On the old ones, while they look the same as far as what you stick in front of you, they have those 2 RCA connectors on them. If I can hold it still long enough for me to talk about. And so you have that braided section, and that braid often breaks off from the RCA plug, and it's really hard to solder to because it gets so much yuck over the years. And the white plastic on the other one, which is for the tremolo, that white plastic in the ones made today, it just breaks off in little chunks. It just falls apart. It can be very difficult to resolder. There's no guarantee that if you do resolder it and fix it, that it'll hold up, because the white insulation just cracks and breaks. It's awful. So the new Footswitch is actually better than the old Footswitch in that regard. Here at the rear, we have the speaker cable. It is a one-piece molded plastic cable / plug all together. It often fails. It's not very reliable. If you're going to be playing gigs, let alone going on the road, I recommend replacing it with a Switchcraft or Neutrik or Rheon, or almost any brand of plug is going to be better than that molded one. And a 18-inch length of real cable. It's easy to do. You can solder it to the speaker instead of having the quick connects. It's much better. The speaker in most reissues is the C12K, which is not a fantastic speaker, but that's subjective. We'll talk about that later. Now notice that the speaker goes into the left interior speaker connection, internal speaker connection. If you plug it into the one on the right, you won't have much sound at all because the left jack shunts to ground when not in use. So if you're running one speaker, use the internal connection. A lot of guys make that mistake, especially on the Hot Rod series where you can't see it from behind. If you guess wrong, you do the one on the right, you'll have no sound. Won't hurt the amp, you just won't have any sound. So make sure you have it connected to the correct speaker jack. And that C12K, just about every speaker out there in the world that's 8 ohms and 12 inches would be a better choice. But this is the one most amps have, and it really colors people's opinions of the Fender reissues. So much of what we hear is the speaker. I know it's subjective, but it's so crucial to understand. I've got a video comparing the C12K to 3 other speakers, and I'm just going to link that below if you want to see if you agree with me or not. That's fine if you don't. Speaker choice is highly personal and subjective. Most of the things I'm going to be raising about this Fender reissue series are objective, based on observing the same failures over and over again, the same issues over and over again. Speakers, that's where personal taste comes in. I want to show you the reverb bag stuff. So I've taken the rear panel off, and I've taken the 2 screws out to hold the reverb bag in place. And I'm about to pull the bag out of the tank out of the bag. And I think I was making a plea for people to vacuum out to the bottoms of the combos maybe once or twice a year because it gets real nasty. Just get a baseboard brush cleaner attachment for your vacuum. It'll take you a minute and makes a big difference in the funk nastiness down the road. Notice that the tank is magnetic and wants to stick to the speaker. That's always fun. It's just in the bag, sitting on a piece of cardboard, which seems pretty crappy, but it's actually a pretty good choice, unless you want to make a custom wooden panel with screws. See, it wants to stick to that damn speaker again. It's always a lot of fun with these. And this is a Belton Accutronics tank. The construction is not great. The reliability is not great. The sound is sometimes okay, sometimes not. The springs break. The little connectors that press on to the transducers break. The transducers are usually loose in the frame. The extra weight of that quick connect or Molex or whatever it is connected to the transducers puts strains on the transducers. The RCA receptacles are crappy. The little wires are really fragile. It's just not a very high quality reverb tank, and it's prone to a lot of flaws. When someone says, hey, my reissue has no reverb, on any other amp I would check the 12AT7 or the recovery stage tube on the reissues. I usually go inside the bag and horrors await. Let me show you a better reverb tank. This is the short version of a reverb tank that's used today. This is one marketed by Ruby. It's a 3-spring short tank rather than a long 2-spring tank. Other than that, it has the correct input and output impedance for Fender use, and it'll work fine for our examples. The same construction is used in the longer ones with 2 or 3 springs. And this style of tank is sold by Ruby, it's sold by MOD, it's sold by Mojotone, and it's sold by Tube Amp Doctor. And as far as I can tell, there are 2 main places in the world that make reverb tanks for guitar amps. There's the Accutronics Belton style, like this. You can see Accutronics Belton. And there's this style, which MOD, Ruby, Tube Amp Doctor, and Mojotone all use as far as the manufacturer. I believe they can spec them out differently because I have heard different and consistently different results from, say, MOD to Mojotone. Of the tanks on the market today, as of recording this video, May of 2022, I think the Mojotones are the best sounding. 3 years ago, I would have said the MODs, but consistency's not anyone's strong suit right now in manufacturing. But they have the wires directly attached to the transducers. The transducers are within the frame. They're much more solidly secured, and they have much better RCA connections. And if I had to have one where neither was insulated or both were insulated, I could easily make that adjustment on these, unlike the ones on the little Accutronics Belton. So if you're not going to have an old vintage Gibbs or Accutronics from the 60s or 70s, and most of us don't, the Ruby, the TAD, the MOD, and the Mojotone are vastly superior to the Accutronics in Belton. And they're all within $10, $15 of each other. So it's not like this is some really expensive holy grail and this is what most of us have to settle for. We'll see how it sounds when the time comes, but they're not great about longevity. Now, before I pull the chassis out of the cabinet, I want to talk about construction. Fender on the Reissue series, pretty much on all their amps, but especially on the Reissue series, is not the world's best about tightening the hardware. So if you get one, take an 11 by 32 socket, deep well. Make sure that all the nuts holding the speaker in place are tight. That one is. That one is. This is good. Many times they're almost not quite free spinning, but usually pretty much on the verge of loose. This one's good, but it never hurts to check. The other thing that happens, see the screw here? There are 4 screws, two on each side, one down here and one up top, and they hold the baffle, the front baffle, which holds the speaker, to the sides of the cabinet. These are often loose, and I like to check them. Sometimes they're loose from the factory, sometimes they're not. It's very common as these amps get older and get used for those screws to become loose, even if they originally were not. Different temperatures and humidities, and this wood is plywood, and this wood is solid pine, and they expand and contract at different rates, and the metal stays the same, so they can become loose in time. So get a number 2 Phillips screwdriver and tighten those up, maybe once or twice a year. Make sure your caps nuts holding your speaker in place are good. It makes everything sound and last better. I'll show you how to remove the chassis from the cabinet. First of all, there's one screw here, which goes to a little plastic tab that secures the power cable to the side of the cabinet. Sometimes it can be easier to remove the rectifier tube and or the first power tubes to have a little more room for access. It depends on where they screwed it in place. And that is essentially a number 8 or 10, I'm not sure, sheet metal screw, about 3/4 of an inch long. Put that to the side, take a note of where it was and where you put it. And then 3 more of the exact same screws, one here, and one here. You remove them the same way. I'll remove one on camera, and you can extrapolate the rest. And because these are fairly coarse sheet metal screws going into wood, unless you have a very nice power tool with adjustable, settable torque, do that by hand. It doesn't take too long, and it can really save the wood in the long run, because you want to not just keep reopening it every time you do that. Once those 3 screws holding the lip of the chassis to the underside of the cabinet are out of the way, there are 2 screws on either side that hold these metal straps. You can do it by hand, it's not difficult. It's a number 2 screwdriver. I'm going to use a power tool. It's a machine screw that goes into an insert built into the chassis rather than a sheet metal screw into wood. So you can use a power tool, no problem, until it no longer comes up. That means it's no longer catching the threads of the receivers in the chassis. Then I grab both sides and I just pull up. Sometimes it's really easy, sometimes they fight because the Tolex kind of bunches up in these holes and offers some resistance. You can put these carefully to the side. You can also just touch them to the speaker if you want to have the speaker hold them in place. See, that can be handy dandy. Let me get the other 2 out. All right, they're out. The speaker's holding that hardware very nicely. Now let's look at the very important thing before we try to pull the chassis out. This bit's a little bit difficult to film because the eye sees things very differently than a camera. You see that white strip in the far distance there on the other side of the chassis? That is the gap between the front of the metal of the chassis and the cabinet in the front. And a lot of times I don't know if I can show this, but I'll talk about it. A lot of times from Fender, that chassis will actually grab onto the metal shielding that's on the underside of the cabinet, and it will pull it down. It's like heavy duty aluminum foil. And if you look at it from this side, it's easy to see with the eye, if not with this camera. If you see it sticking, you'll see like light, and then there won't be any light for a little area, and then there'll be light. Where you're not seeing any light, that's where that foil has adhered to the metal and is pulling down. If you see that, take a table knife, take a putty knife. I like this dough cutter, and I'll show you on this side. Say that the foil is cutting here. I will slide it in here and try to just get the lip of that foil and press it up and press it up. and go all around, gently moving that foil up until you see that daylight. Then you'll take it between the foil and the top of the chassis and just push up and bring it across, and then gets that foil up against the top of the chassis, and it's no longer sticking to the up against the top of the cabinet rather. Then it won't be sticking to your metal chassis, which means when you pull the chassis out, you're not going to be shredding that foil. Not only is it bad because you're causing some minor damage to your amp and you're diminishing its effectiveness as a shield, you're also getting little shriveled bits of aluminum all scattered throughout your chassis. And if you miss one, it is conductive. You can short something out. So do that before pulling the chassis. Before we remove the chassis from the amp, I'm going to show you one way that usually works to discharge capacitors, at least to the point where you will be safe,